Imagine a world where rejection festers like an unhealed wound, growing deeper with every perceived slight. For one man, this rejection turned into rage, a rage so powerful it would forever scar an unsuspecting community. This is the story of Elliot Rodger, a young man who saw himself as a victim of a society that he claimed was blind to his greatness. In his mind, the world was cruel, women were shallow, and his peers undeserving. And so, he planned his vengeance, a day of retribution that would turn his dark fantasies into a horrifying reality. But who was Elliot Rodger? What shaped him into the self-proclaimed supreme gentleman who believed violence was his only option? This is a tale of entitlement, isolation, and unchecked resentment, a cautionary story about the dangers of loneliness and how radical ideologies can fester in the shadows. Let's go back to the very beginning. July 24, 1991, in London, England. That's when Elliot Rodger was born. His father, Peter Rodger, was a filmmaker, creative and ambitious, constantly dreaming up ideas for movies. His mother, Lichin, had a practical but artistic side herself, working as a nurse on film sets. From the outside, it seemed like Elliot was born into a world of opportunity. Elliot's parents seemed to have it all figured out, but they wanted more chances, more career success. So, in 1996, when Elliot was just 5 years old, the family packed their things and moved to Los Angeles, California. Elliot's parents seemed to have it all figured out, but they wanted more chances, more career success. So, in 1996, when Elliot was just 5 years old, the family packed their things and moved to Los Angeles, California. Imagine that shift, a young boy moving from rainy England to the bustling, sunny streets of Los Angeles. It must have felt like stepping into a whole new world. His father was pursuing big dreams in Hollywood, and life appeared promising. But even in a life filled with privilege, something was missing for young Elliot. He attended Topanga Elementary School, a place full of curious, energetic children. Yet, there was Elliot, often alone, watching from the sidelines. He was described as shy, painfully shy. He didn't know how to join conversations or approach other kids. Even at that young age, he felt different, almost invisible. It's a hard feeling for a child to watch other kids laugh and play while you stand on the outside looking in. Elliot wanted to be accepted. He longed to be one of the cool kids, but he lacked the confidence to make friends. Meanwhile, his father was busy chasing his filmmaking dreams, and his mother was working long hours. They loved their son, but perhaps they didn't see the loneliness building inside him. Then, when Elliot was just 7 years old, his world was shaken by something many children face: divorce. His parents' separation forced Elliot and his younger sister, Georgia, to split their time between two households. 1 week here, 1 week there, it's a routine many children of divorced parents know all too well. But for Elliot, it added to his growing sense of instability. He never quite felt like he belonged anywhere. Not long after the divorce, Peter remarried a Moroccan actress named Soumaya Akahaban. She was glamorous, confident, and full of energy. But Elliot never saw her as part of his family. In fact, he resented her. He didn't want to take orders from someone he considered an outsider. It's common for children to struggle with accepting a step-parent. But in Elliot's case, that resentment festered and grew over the years. It was one more piece of dissatisfaction piling up inside him. Despite living in a wealthy environment, attending good schools, and having access to privileges many children could only dream of, Elliot struggled socially. His introverted nature and awkward demeanor made him an easy target for teasing. By the time he was a teenager, the isolation was taking a toll on him. It's important to understand kids like Elliot don't always show their struggles outwardly. They might not cry or throw tantrums, but the loneliness is there, quietly gnawing away at them. As he grew older, Elliot found solace in video games, particularly World of Warcraft. In this virtual world, he could escape from the harsh realities of school and social rejection. Here, he didn't have to worry about fitting in or being judged. But virtual worlds can only distract you for so long. Looking back, it's easy to see the early warning signs: the loneliness, the resentment, the desire for acceptance that went unfulfilled. But at that time, he was just a boy trying to navigate a world that felt increasingly hostile. The cracks in his seemingly privileged life had already begun to form. And as time went on, those cracks would only deepen. Teenage years are tough for almost everyone. It's a time when kids start to figure out who they are, make friends, and navigate the sometimes overwhelming world of high school. But for Elliot Rodger, these years became a dark chapter filled with rejection, bitterness, and an increasing sense of resentment. Elliot bounced between several schools, searching for a place where he could fit in. But no matter where he went, the same problem followed him: he just couldn't connect with other people. He was awkward in conversations, often unsure of what to say, and painfully aware of his social failures. You see, when you're a teenager, loneliness can feel unbearable. Watching your peers form friendships, date, and thrive while you're stuck on the sidelines is like carrying a weight that never lets up. For Elliot, that weight grew heavier with each passing year. By the time he was 16, his insecurities were taking over. He became obsessed with his looks, believing that his appearance was the reason girls didn't notice him. He would spend hours in front of the mirror, examining every flaw, convinced that if he just looked better, everything would change. But here's the thing: improving your appearance doesn't matter much if you don't have the confidence to back it up. And Elliot lacked that confidence entirely. His parents grew concerned and took him to see a psychiatrist. He was prescribed risperidone, a medication commonly used to treat mental health conditions like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. But Elliot refused to take it. He was convinced that there was nothing wrong with him. In his mind, the problem wasn't him, it was the world. Women were shallow and cruel for not noticing him, and society was broken for valuing people he considered inferior. By the age of 18, his resentment had fully taken root. He became obsessed with the idea that he was missing out on something essential: romantic relationships, sexual experiences, the things he saw his peers enjoying. And instead of looking inward to improve himself, he blamed everyone else. Entitlement is a dangerous mindset. It's the belief that you deserve something just because you exist. And when life doesn't give you what you think you're owed, that entitlement can quickly turn into rage. There were moments when his anger bubbled over into disturbing behavior. One time, he threw a hot cup of coffee on a couple simply because he saw them kissing. It was as if their happiness was a personal insult to him. These incidents may seem minor, but they were warning signs, signals that something was deeply wrong. Another outlet for his growing resentment was the internet. Elliot began posting videos online, ranting about women and the men he saw as more socially successful. These rants were filled with bitterness and a warped sense of superiority. He believed he was better than everyone else, but the world just didn't recognize it. These videos were a window into his deteriorating mental state. They were disturbing, filled with rage and entitlement. And yet, at that point, they were largely ignored by the outside world. By the end of his teenage years, Elliot had become a loner in every sense of the word. He had dropped out of social circles, spent most of his time online or playing video games, and nurtured a growing hatred for the world around him. It's heartbreaking to think about. So many people feel lonely during their teenage years, but most find a way through it. They meet friends, discover passions, or simply grow out of their insecurities. But Elliot didn't. He let those feelings fester and grow until they consumed him completely. These teenage years, filled with isolation and resentment, laid the foundation for what was to come. It was during this time that Elliot began to see himself not just as a victim, but as someone destined for a twisted kind of revenge. College is often seen as a fresh start, a place where people can reinvent themselves, find friends, and discover their passions. For Elliot Rodger, college was supposed to be the solution to all his problems. He imagined it as a place where he would finally become the confident, admired man he believed he was destined to be. But things didn't go the way he hoped. In 2011, Elliot moved to Isla Vista to attend Santa Barbara City College. Isla Vista is a picturesque town, a student paradise, filled with young people riding bikes, enjoying beach parties, and living carefree lives. But for Elliot, it became a place of frustration and deepening bitterness. From the very beginning, Elliot struggled to fit in. College was a chance for a fresh start, but the same social issues that haunted him in high school followed him here. He expected that just by showing up, people would be drawn to him. But social connections require effort, and Elliot made none. He wouldn't approach people, start conversations, or try to join social events. Instead, he waited for others to come to him. And when they didn't, his resentment only grew. Imagine sitting in a room full of people your age, all laughing and talking, while you feel completely invisible. It's a lonely experience, one that Elliot knew all too well. In a desperate attempt to transform himself, he bought expensive clothes and accessories. He even convinced his mother to help him purchase a sleek black BMW, thinking that material possessions would make him more appealing to women. But here's the thing: confidence doesn't come from the clothes you wear or the car you drive. It comes from within. And Elliot had none of it. His living situation didn't help matters. He clashed constantly with his housemates, who found his behavior strange and off-putting. Arguments escalated, and at one point, his outbursts turned racist and aggressive. Eventually, he was forced to move out after multiple altercations. Elliot didn't see these incidents as his fault. He believed his housemates were beneath him, inferior people who didn't recognize his supposed greatness. By 2012, Elliot had dropped out of college entirely. He had given up on academics and retreated further into isolation. His days were spent alone in his room, playing video games, browsing the internet, and nursing his growing hatred for the world. Loneliness can be a breeding ground for dangerous thoughts. Without meaningful social connections or a sense of purpose, Elliot's mind became a dark and hostile place. It was during this time that he began planning what he called his day of retribution. He poured his thoughts into journals, meticulously detailing his grievances and fantasies of revenge. His writings revealed a twisted worldview, one where women were to blame for his misery, and violence was the only solution. He saw himself as a tragic figure, a misunderstood genius who had been wronged by society. The internet became both his escape and his echo chamber. He found communities that fueled his toxic beliefs, particularly within the incel, involuntary celibate, subculture. These forums validated his hatred and gave him a sense of belonging, albeit a dangerous one. When loneliness meets radical ideology, it creates a perfect storm. And Elliot was right in the middle of it. In preparation for his attack, he legally purchased multiple firearms. Despite his disturbing online activity and history of mental health issues, there were no red flags that prevented him from acquiring these deadly weapons. This oversight would later be a point of national debate: how someone so clearly troubled could access weapons so easily. As he stood on the brink of adulthood, Elliot had abandoned hope for a normal life. His isolation, resentment, and entitlement had transformed him into a person consumed by hatred. The idea of revenge became his only focus. It's chilling to think how different things might have been if someone had reached him, if he had found even one meaningful connection or sought real help for his mental struggles. But instead, he was hurtling toward disaster. This period of Elliot Rodger's life, the college years, was a turning point. It was when his fantasies of violence began to solidify into a horrifying plan. And soon, Isla Vista would bear the brunt of his twisted day of retribution. As Elliot Rodger withdrew deeper into isolation, he began crafting a disturbing document that would later be known as his manifesto. This 137-page autobiography was more than just a personal diary. It was a twisted blueprint for revenge, filled with grievances, fantasies of violence, and a chilling plan for mass murder. He titled it My Twisted World. In this document, he meticulously detailed his life from childhood to adulthood, focusing heavily on the perceived injustices he believed had been inflicted upon him. To Elliot, women were the primary villains, responsible for his loneliness and misery. His manifesto wasn't just about his hatred of women, though. He also harbored resentment toward men who were successful socially and romantically. In his mind, they were less deserving than him, yet they had everything he craved. I have lived a life of pain and suffering, and it has all been at the hands of humanity. Elliot saw himself as a tragic figure, a victim of a cruel world that refused to recognize his greatness. This delusion fueled his entitlement, convincing him that he was justified in seeking revenge. As the months went by, his fantasies of revenge turned into detailed plans. He envisioned a day where he would punish the world for ignoring and rejecting him. He called it his day of retribution. This wasn't just a fleeting thought, it was a meticulously crafted plan, one that would eventually lead to unimaginable tragedy. He planned every detail, from what he would wear to the order of events. First, he intended to kill his stepmother and half-brother, whom he blamed for his unhappiness at home. Then he would return to Isla Vista, where he would target his housemates and proceed to a nearby sorority house. The sorority house was a central part of his plan. To Elliot, it symbolized everything he hated: beautiful women who he believed had cruelly rejected him. In preparation, he legally purchased multiple firearms. Despite his troubling online presence and history of mental health issues, there were no red flags that prevented him from acquiring these weapons. He also stockpiled ammunition and practiced at shooting ranges to perfect his aim. This glaring oversight in the system would later be a point of national debate: how someone so clearly troubled could legally arm themselves so thoroughly. His manifesto became increasingly detailed, filled with disturbing fantasies of violence and revenge. He described how he would carry out each attack and even how he wanted to be remembered after his death. To read his writings is to step into a mind consumed by hatred and delusion. There's a terrifying level of calculation and self-pity in every page. Alongside his manifesto, Elliot began posting videos online. In these rants, he expressed his bitterness and hatred toward women and society. He often spoke with a chilling calmness, as if what he was saying was perfectly rational. These videos offered a glimpse into his disturbed psyche, a man who saw himself as both a victim and a righteous avenger. As the day of his planned attack drew closer, Elliot's behavior became increasingly erratic. He stopped speaking to his parents and spent most of his time alone, finalizing his plans. It's haunting to think how close the world came to stopping this tragedy. There were so many warning signs: his disturbing videos, his manifesto, his isolation. But no one intervened in time. Elliot Rodger's manifesto and planning phase represent the point of no return. His fantasies had transformed into a horrifying reality, a reality that would soon shatter countless lives. May 23, 2014, was a warm, sunny day in Isla Vista, California. Students filled the streets, enjoying the start of the weekend in this idyllic seaside community. But as night fell, the tranquility would be shattered by an unspeakable act of violence, a rampage orchestrated by Elliot Rodger in what he called his day of retribution. The nightmare began in the quiet confines of his own apartment. Elliot's first victims were his housemates, 3 young men who had the misfortune of living with him. In a premeditated attack, Elliot armed himself with a knife and brutally stabbed them to death. The first victim was Chen Yu and James Hong, followed by Vihan David Wang, and finally George Chen. These young men had their entire lives ahead of them, but in Elliot's twisted mind, they were obstacles to his plan. After murdering his housemates, Elliot armed himself with 3 semi-automatic handguns and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He then uploaded a final video titled Elliot Rodger's Retribution, a chilling manifesto in which he declared his intention to punish women for rejecting him and men for living better lives. It was a message filled with hatred, entitlement, and a disturbing sense of justification. Elliot's next target was the Alpha Phi sorority house, which he viewed as a symbol of everything he despised. He arrived just after 9:30 p.m., armed and ready to carry out a massacre. He banged on the door, but no one answered. Frustrated, he turned his rage on 2 women standing nearby, Veronica Weiss and Catherine Cooper. Both were shot and killed instantly. Another young woman was critically injured but miraculously survived. With his initial plan disrupted, Elliot began driving through Isla Vista, randomly targeting pedestrians. He opened fire on a group outside a deli, killing Christopher Michael Martinez, a 20-year-old student who had simply gone out for a sandwich. Imagine being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This senseless violence robbed Christopher of a future filled with promise. As police officers responded to reports of gunfire, Elliot engaged in multiple shootouts with them. Despite being hit in the hip, he continued his rampage, crashing into cyclists and pedestrians without hesitation. His car became a weapon, his hatred fueling every reckless move. Eventually, his rampage came to an end. After crashing his car, Elliot took his own life with a gunshot to the head before law enforcement could apprehend him. In the span of just a few minutes, 6 innocent lives had been taken, and 14 others were injured. Isla Vista, once a peaceful community, was left traumatized by the senseless violence. The aftermath was a scene of grief and disbelief. Families mourned the loss of their loved ones, and a community struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy. Elliot's actions were a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred, entitlement, and loneliness. His rampage was not just an attack on individuals but on the very fabric of a community. Richard Martinez, devastated by the loss of his son, became a powerful voice for gun control advocacy. His emotional plea not one more sparked a national conversation about gun violence and mental health. While the pain of loss can never be undone, his courage in speaking out brought hope to many who sought change. The Isla Vista massacre was a tragedy that left scars on countless lives. But in its aftermath, there was a call for understanding, a reminder that we must address the root causes of such violence before it's too late. The aftermath of the Isla Vista massacre left a community shattered and grieving. Families mourned the loss of their loved ones, friends tried to make sense of the senseless, and survivors carried both physical and emotional scars that would take years to heal. Vigils were held throughout the community, as people came together to honor the lives lost. The names Veronica Weiss, Catherine Cooper, Christopher Michael Martinez, Chen Yu and James Hong, Vihan David Wang, and George Chen became symbols of a tragedy that demanded justice and reflection. It's hard to imagine the depth of loss these families experienced. Parents who sent their children to college with dreams of bright futures were now left with heartbreak and unanswered questions. "Not one more," he said through tears, urging the nation to confront its gun violence epidemic. Richard Martinez's impassioned plea became a rallying cry for gun control advocacy. His courage to speak out in the face of unimaginable grief inspired a national movement. The massacre sparked conversations that reverberated across the nation. How could someone with such clear signs of mental distress legally acquire firearms? Why were the warning signs his disturbing online videos and manifesto ignored? Elliot Rodger's case highlighted significant failures in the system. Despite multiple interactions with mental health professionals and law enforcement, no effective intervention was made. Elliot's connection to the Incel community, a group notorious for its misogynistic and dangerous ideology, also became a point of concern. His manifesto revealed a twisted sense of entitlement and resentment toward women and socially successful men. This dark corner of the internet, once dismissed as fringe, was now recognized as a breeding ground for hatred and radicalization. The Massacre forced society to confront the dangers of online echo chambers that fuel violent ideologies. Experts emphasized the need for early intervention in cases of social isolation and entitlement-driven mental health issues. They warned that unchecked resentment could spiral into violence if not addressed. It became clear that the stigma surrounding mental health needed to be dismantled, and communities needed better tools to support those struggling with loneliness and rage. In response to the tragedy, California enacted stricter gun control measures, including the Gun Violence Restraining Order law, which allowed family members and law enforcement to petition for the temporary removal of firearms from individuals deemed a threat to themselves or others. This was a step forward, but many argued that it was too little, too late. The debate over gun control continues to this day, with no clear resolution in sight. Elliot's father, Peter Rodger, expressed profound sorrow and remorse. He grappled with guilt, wondering if he could have done more to prevent the tragedy. Peter's heartbreak was palpable. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't reach his son in time. His story is a reminder of the complexities of parenting a child with mental health struggles. Elliot Rodger's rampage left an indelible mark on Isla Vista and the nation. His actions were a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked resentment, entitlement, and radicalization. But in the wake of tragedy, there was also resilience, a community that came together to heal, advocates who fought for change, and voices that refused to be silenced. While we may never fully understand what drove Elliot to commit such atrocities, his story serves as a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that isolation, hatred, and entitlement are a deadly combination. Recognizing the warning signs, offering support to those struggling, and addressing threats seriously can make all the difference. And so, life goes on. The community of Isla Vista continues to heal, carrying the memory of those lost. Their lives were cut short, but their stories live on as a call for compassion, understanding, and vigilance. This has been a deep dive into the tragedy of Elliot Rodger and the Isla Vista Massacre. May we learn from this story and strive to build a world where such horrors are never repeated. The case of Elliot Rodger is a stark and haunting reminder of the dangers that arise when personal grievances fester unchecked, when loneliness turns into bitterness, and when entitlement morphs into violent ideology. It's a tragedy that speaks not only to the failings of an individual but also to larger societal issues, mental health struggles, isolation, and the profound impact of online radicalization. As we look back on the events of May 23, 2014, we are faced with a chilling question: could this tragedy have been prevented? We may never know the full answer. But what we do know is that the Isla Vista Massacre left scars on families, friends, and a community that will never fully heal. Elliot Rodger's actions were a devastating result of a series of failures, both personal and systemic, that we must learn from. We cannot afford to ignore the signs of deepening isolation in those around us. We cannot overlook the power of unchecked resentment, especially in today's digital age, where online echo chambers can amplify hate and radicalize vulnerable individuals. If we are to prevent future tragedies, we must take action now. We must support mental health initiatives, foster open conversations about loneliness and entitlement, and, most importantly, we must be vigilant in recognizing and addressing dangerous ideologies before they lead to violence. This story is not just about one man's descent into violence, It's about all of us, how we respond to the challenges facing our society and, more critically, how we respond to each other. Compassion, empathy, and understanding can be the antidote to the poison of hatred and isolation. It's never too late to make a difference. If this story has moved you or made you think differently about the dangers of unchecked resentment and radicalization, take a moment to share it with someone you care about. You never know how your action might spark a conversation or bring awareness to someone in need. Like, share, and subscribe to help spread awareness. Let's make sure that the lessons from this tragedy are not forgotten. By speaking out, we can prevent future tragedies, create safer spaces, and make a meaningful impact in the fight against violence and radicalization. Together, we can help build a world where such tragedies are not inevitable, and where compassion and understanding triumph over hate and division. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care and stay safe.